my parents, if they were still alive, would still think it was particularly odd, given the fact that I grew up in New York.
That's not where he's visiting from.
No, they would think it was odd, as do all my relatives, that I spent the last 40 years in Birmingham, Alabama. My relatives really think it's odd. So odd that they vowed never to visit me. And they never have. Anyway, those lights are so damn bright. It's a good thing I can't see you, or else I probably wouldn't be able to continue. I'm going to tell a story about, like Peter's, something that happened many years ago. The only difference is that the distance between the time that Peter was telling his story and when the events of his story happened are much shorter than the distance between me telling this story now and when it actually happened, which was about 612 years ago. This story takes place in the mid-50s, when I was growing up. And it has to do with one of my grade school teachers who, and this is where the obsession comes in, I began increasingly obsessively to hate. And why? It was because she was so gentle and kind. But she was gentle and kind in this way that when she went to correct you gently and kindly, she always made you feel like, you're just a little asshole. What's the matter with you? Now, you know the old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, today we have no child is left behind, which means that everybody has to learn everything in exactly the same way, or else you fail the test. There's no creativity involved. We like to think that back in the mid-50s we're a lot more expansive than that, especially since it was the end of the war, everything was booming, everybody was happy, everybody was making a lot of money. Yeah, no. In school, you had to answer the questions exactly the same way for Mrs. Gabia, or else she'd get that look in her eye like, you're just a little asshole. So we always had these little history quizzes. Every week, she'd teach us history, and then at the end of the week, she'd ask you, and this was always the same question, regardless of what the lesson was, who are your 3 most important favorite heroes in American history? And we all were supposed to always answer George Washington, because he was the first president. Abraham Lincoln, because he freed the slaves. And Thomas Jefferson, because he wrote the Constitution. And everybody always answered those same 3 answers. And she got this look on her face like, boom, I am the greatest teacher ever. You are the smartest kids ever. We are leaving here with a new dynamic America that's going to lead us into the future and bring us John F. Kennedy as the president. Well, I began to hate her. Because we always had to answer the same question. And then, in the same way. And then one day, this unbelievable, it was like a coming together of the cosmos. When all the students decided, either consciously or unconsciously, I'm not going to say George Washington, I'm not going to say Abraham Lincoln, and I'm sure as hell you're going to say Thomas Jefferson. So, she's going around the room, asking everybody who their 3 favorite heroes are. Yeah, the first 10 kids answered George Washington. And then she gets to Dave Dukorsky. And for some reason, Dave says, to answer who are your three favorite heroes, he says, George Washington, predictably, Abraham Lincoln, predictably, and then he says, Harry S. Truman. Well, Mrs. Gabriel, who always corrected us very gently, looked at Dave and said, well, Dave, why Harry S. Truman? And she's got this look in her eye like, you asshole. And Dave says, well, my father told me that Harry S. Truman was one of the great American presidents. And Mrs. Gabia said, why is that, Dave? And Dave said, without missing a beat, in his exact words, Dave said, my father told me that Harry S. Truman was a great president because he dropped the atom bomb on the Japs and killed 1 million people. Only he said, 1 million fucking people. Now, in the 1950s, in my school, which was very liberal, you could say a lot of things. But one thing you could not say was the word Japs. So Mrs. Gay, everybody's like me, like in this, but you know, I could see her collecting her calm and saying to Dave, Dave, well, you know, really, the third most important president, the greatest hero, was Thomas Jefferson. And in this school, we do not use the term Japs. And even me, at the age of 7, I'm thinking, what happened to fucking? So she moves on, happily moves on. And she comes to Janie Ostheimer. And Janie, God bless her. Well, you'll see. She gets to Janie, and she says, Janie who? And Janie says, Betty Crocker. Yeah, no kidding. It was about time somebody threw a Betty Crocker anybody. You know, maybe Eisenhower, what the hell? So, Mrs. Gibbs says, who else? And Janie says, no, Betty Crocker. 3 times. Why 3 times? And again, without missing a beat. Janie must have thought this out. She said, Betty Crocker invented, sorry, she invented brownies, the American stove, and chocolate. What? I mean, we knew Janie was ahead of her time because years later she became famous for cooking and disseminating certain kinds of brownies. So Mrs. Gandy, again, you can see that look in her eye, like, oh, bro, you know, what am I dealing with? Like, oh, classroom now, asshole. So she says, well, Janie, we know Betty Crocker didn't invent chocolate. So Janie very innocently looks up at her and says, who did? And inexplicably, Mrs. Gabia, God bless her, said, the Jews. I mean, at 7 years old, Orthodox though my grandfather was, and just the opposite end of the spectrum, my mother became secular, agnostic, no religion, maybe Jewish is a religion. I knew the Jews did not invent chocolate. So, Mrs. Gabriel leaves it now and gets to me. She said, Carl, who are your favorite? Now, I am obsessed with fucking Mrs. Gabriel. But I had thought about this, and this was going to be my answer anyway. I said, Mrs. Gabriel, my three favorite heroes are Roy Rogers, Willie Mays, and Howdy Doody. I mean, she went like, no. She didn't even know what to say. She just stood there looking at me, and I knew I better say something quick or get her a glass of water or the school nurse. She was going to faint dead away. So she said, it's fine. Calm. Why those three people? You know it's George Washington. And I said, well, Mrs. Gabriel, it's obvious. And I'm obsessed with getting my point across. I'm going to let her know. Roy Rogers, Willie Mays, Howdy Doody represent truth, justice, and the American fucking way. Why? Truth, Howdy Doody, and Buffalo Bob. I know many of you are too young to remember them. Buffalo Bob would always sit with Howdy at the end of the show and explain to us children why it was so important to tell the truth. And to this day, Howdy is one of my heroes. Same thing with Roy. Roy, always justice, and Willie, the American way, because he rose from the dregs of an American South to become one of the greatest baseball players ever. And so, to end this, I will say, God bless Howdy, Roy, and Willie.